In October of 1094, a silver-armored knight rode out from the gates of Valencia alongside Rodrigo Díaz de Vivar, el Cid, to face the most feared army in the world. 25,000 Almoravid warriors who had crushed every Christian force they'd encountered, an empire stretching from Senegal to the Ebro River, now camped just 4 kilometers from the city walls with drums that shook the earth and shields made from antelope hide that could stop any blade. Our good knight stood with just 4,000 men against this North African superpower in a battle that would either secure the first Christian principality in Muslim Spain or end in the complete annihilation of El Cid's dream. This wasn't a fair fight. It was asymmetric warfare at its finest. A masterclass in deception where the battle was won before the first lance was couched, where heavy cavalry would shatter the myth of Berber invincibility, and where a flanking maneuver so audacious it seemed suicidal would become the stuff of legend watchers. The good knight rides through burning orchards, charges into an enemy camp with 3,000 knights at his back, and witnesses the psychological collapse of an empire that thought itself unstoppable. Subscribe to the GoodKnight Stories for more immersive historical journeys that put you in the saddle during history's most pivotal moments, where every decision meant life or death, and every charge could change the fate of nations. Comment below which battle you'd like the good knight to witness next. But for now, settle in, relax, and ride with us back to October 21st, 1094, when the fate of Valencia, and perhaps all of Christian Spain, hung in the balance. Chapter 1. The Weight of Silver. The good knight had worn his armor for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to stand without it. 12 kilograms of riveted iron mail, each ring hammered and linked by hand, each one a small fortune in itself, hung from his shoulders like a second skin. Beneath the hauberk, the padded gambeson was soaked through with sweat despite the October chill. The weight distributed itself across his frame in a way that was both familiar and exhausting. The pressure on his collarbones, the pull on his lower back, the constant reminder that he was encased in metal. He stood on the ramparts of Valencia, looking west toward the village of Cuarte, and tried to count the enemy tents. He stopped at 300. There were thousands more. The Almoravid camp stretched across the plain like a second city, a sprawling mass of white and brown canvas that seemed to pulse with life even in the pre-dawn darkness. Cooking fires dotted the landscape like fallen stars. The sound that emanated from that camp was unlike anything the good knight had heard in all his years of war, a low, rhythmic thunder that never ceased, day or night. The drums. They had been beating for weeks now, ever since the Almoravid army had arrived in August. The sound was designed to unnerve, to remind the defenders of Valencia that they were surrounded, outnumbered, and, according to every rational calculation, doomed. The good knight had learned to sleep through the drums. Barely. He shifted his weight, feeling the kite shield on his left arm, the long sword at his hip, the conical nasal helmet tucked under his right arm. His destrier, a grey Iberian warhorse named Tormenta, stood in the stable below, already saddled, already waiting. The horse knew. Animals always knew when battle was coming. Behind him, the city of Valencia was silent in that particular way that cities are silent when they're holding their breath. The siege had lasted 19 months before Cid had finally taken the city in June. 19 months of starvation, of burning the orchards, of cutting the irrigation channels that fed the Huerta, the fertile plain that surrounded the city like a green halo. The good knight had been there for all of it, watching the city slowly strangle itself, watching the price of a rat climb higher than a loaf of bread, watching the desperate eat leather and grass. When the city finally fell, it fell quietly. And then, 2 months later, the Almoravids arrived. Muhammad ibn Tashfin, nephew of the great emperor Yusuf ibn Tashfin, the man who had shattered the combined armies of Castile and Leon at Sagrajas 8 years prior, had brought an army that dwarfed anything the good knight had ever faced. The estimates varied: 10,000, 15,000, 25,000. It didn't matter. They were enough. They had set up camp at Quart, a village on slightly elevated ground west of the city, near the Turia River. From there, they controlled the western approaches and the agricultural heartland. They had sent their vanguard forward to Mislata, a smaller village even closer to the walls, where they could harass the gates and cut off any attempt at resupply. It was a textbook siege, except El Cid wasn't following the textbook. The good knight heard footsteps behind him, the distinctive clink of mail, the creak of leather. He turned to see Alvar Fañez, El Cid's right hand, ascending the stone steps to the rampart. Alvar was older than the good knight, his beard streaked with grey, his face carved by decades of sun and war. He carried his helmet in the crook of his arm, and his eyes were sharp despite the early hour. "He's calling the Mesnada," Alvar said quietly. "We ride at dawn." The good knight felt something shift in his chest. Not fear, exactly, but a tightening, a focusing. "All of us? All the knights? The infantry stays to hold the walls." Alvar glanced toward the Almoravid camp, his expression unreadable. "He's going for the camp itself." The good knight followed his gaze. The camp at Cuarte, not the vanguard at Mislata, not a defensive sortie to drive off skirmishers. The camp. "That's madness," the good knight said, though his voice lacked conviction. Alvar smiled, a thin, wolfish expression. "That's why it might work." Chapter 2. The CID's gambit, Rodrigo Díaz de Vivar stood in the center of the great hall of the Alcázar, the former palace of the Muslim emirs, now his seat of power. The room was lit by oil lamps that cast long shadows across the tiled floor, and the air smelled of smoke and old incense. El Cid was not a large man, but he filled the room nonetheless. He was in his early 50s, his beard still dark but flecked with silver, his eyes the color of iron. He wore a simple tunic and breeches, no armor yet, but his presence was such that every man in the room stood a little straighter when he spoke. The good knight stood among the assembled knights, perhaps 300 of them crowded into the hall. These were the core of El Cid's army, the Mesnada, the personal retinue of professional soldiers who had followed him into exile, who had fought for him in Zaragoza and the Levante, who had starved with him during the siege and celebrated with him when the city fell. They were hard men, veterans, the kind of men who didn't flinch at the sound of drums. El Cid did not raise his voice. He never needed to. "The Almoravids think we are trapped," he began, his tone conversational, almost casual. "They think we will sit behind these walls and wait for them to starve us out, or for King Alfonso to send a relief force that will never come." A few of the knights shifted. The mention of Alfonso was a sore point. The King of Castile had exiled El Cid years ago, and though there had been a tentative reconciliation, no one believed Alfonso would risk his army to save Valencia. "They are wrong," El Cid continued. "We are not trapped. They are." He let that hang in the air for a moment. "They have 20,000 men camped at Cuarte, maybe more. They have supplies for months. They have the best infantry in the world, the Black Guard, the Berber spearmen with their lamped shields that can stop a sword stroke. They have light cavalry that can ride circles around us. They have drummers whose noise alone can panic our horses." El Cid paused, his gaze sweeping the room. "And they have one fatal weakness." The good knight leaned forward slightly, listening. "They think they've already won." El Cid walked to a table where a rough map of the city and surrounding area had been drawn on parchment. He placed his finger on the village of Cuarte. "Their camp is here, 4 kilometers west. Their vanguard is at Mislata, harassing our western gates. They expect us to defend, to react, to wait." He moved his finger to the southern gate of the city, the Batalla Gate, also called the Bortella Gate. "At dawn, we send a small force out the western gates. Infantry, some light cavalry. Enough to make noise. Enough to make them think we're desperate. The vanguard at Mislata will engage. The main Almoravid army will hear the fighting and begin to mobilize. They'll think we're trying to break the siege with a suicidal sortie." He looked up, his eyes glinting in the lamplight. "While they're focused on that, the rest of us, 3,000 knights, ride out the Batalla Gate to the south. We use the terrain, the orchards, the river bends to stay hidden. We ride west in a wide arc, and we hit their camp at Cuarte from the flank and rear." The room was silent. The good knight felt his pulse quicken. It was audacious. It was insane. It was exactly the kind of plan that could either win a battle or get them all killed. "We're not fighting their army," El Cid said quietly. "We're destroying their base. We burn their tents, scatter their supplies, kill their camp followers. We create chaos. And when their soldiers turn and see their camp in flames, when they realize they're cut off from their food and their retreat, they'll break." Alvar Farnez spoke up from the side of the room. "And if they don't break?" El Cid smiled, a cold, predatory expression. "Then we die rich men, because we'll be standing in the middle of the wealthiest camp in Iberia." A few of the knights laughed, nervous, dark laughter. The good knight did not laugh. He was thinking about the ride, the terrain, the timing. If they were spotted too early, the Almoravids would have time to reposition. If the bait force at the western gates failed to draw enough attention, the main army would be waiting for them at Cuarte. If the horses stumbled in the irrigation ditches, if the formation broke, if the surprise was lost. There were 1,000 ways this could go wrong, but there was one way it could go right. El Cid looked directly at the good knight, as if reading his thoughts. "I need men who can ride in silence," he said. "Men who can hold formation through broken ground. Men who can charge into a camp full of enemies and not stop until the tents are burning." He paused. "I need knights." The good knight felt the weight of the hauberk on his shoulders, the weight of the sword at his hip, the weight of every battle he'd ever fought. He nodded. So did every other man in the room. Chapter 3. The Huerta Before Dawn. The good knight led Tormenta through the narrow streets of Valencia in the pre-dawn darkness, the horses' hooves clopping softly on the cobblestones. Around him, the city was coming alive in a strange, muted way. Knights emerging from doorways, squires checking saddles, the faint clink of mail and the creak of leather filling the air. No one spoke. The plan required silence until the last possible moment. The good knight reached the Batalla Gate, where the bulk of the cavalry was assembling. The gate itself was still closed, a massive wooden structure reinforced with iron bands. Torches flickered on either side, casting long shadows across the faces of the waiting men. He recognized many of them. There was Pedro Bermudez, a giant of a man who wielded a lance like a spear. There was Martin Antolines, who had fought beside El Cid since the beginning. There were Mozarabs, Christian Iberians who had lived under Muslim rule, and even a few Muslim. Knights who had thrown their lot in with El Cid rather than submit to the fundamentalist Almoravids. It was a strange coalition, bound together not by faith or blood, but by loyalty to one man. El Cid himself was near the front, mounted on his famous war-horse Babieca, a white destrier that seemed to glow in the torchlight. He wore his full armor now, hauberk, helmet, kite shield emblazoned with a red cross. His sword, Tizona, hung at his side, the blade said to have been taken from a Moorish king. The good knight mounted Tormentor, feeling the familiar shift of weight as the horse adjusted to the armored rider. He checked his lance, a 10-foot shaft of ash wood tipped with a leaf-shaped steel point, and made sure it was secure in the stirrup holder. The lance was his primary weapon, the tool that would turn his body and his horse into a single devastating projectile. He thought about the charge. He had charged before, many times, but never like this. Never into a camp, never as part of a plan that depended entirely on surprise and speed. If they were seen too early, the Almoravids would form their phalanxes, lock their shields, and the charge would shatter against a wall of spears. If they were seen too late, if they reached the camp without resistance, it would be a slaughter. The good knight wasn't sure which outcome he preferred. A horn sounded from the western side of the city, a single sharp note that cut through the darkness. The bait force was moving. El Cid raised his hand and the Batalla gate began to open. The massive wooden doors swung outward with a groan, revealing the dark expanse of the Huerta beyond. The good knight could see the outline of the plain, flat, broken by the geometric patterns of irrigation ditches and orchards. The Turia River was somewhere to the north, a dark ribbon cutting through the landscape. The village of Cuarte was to the west, invisible in the darkness, but marked by the faint glow of campfires. El Cid did not give a speech. He simply spurred Babieca forward, and the column began to move. 3,000 knights rode out of Valencia in near silence, the only sounds the creak of saddles, the jingle of mail, and the soft thunder of hooves on earth. The good knight rode in the middle of the column, surrounded by men he trusted with his life. The formation was tight, too tight for comfort, but necessary to avoid being spotted. They rode south initially, away from the Almoravid positions, using the cover of the city walls to mask their movement. Then, gradually, they began to turn west. The terrain was treacherous in the darkness. The Huerta was crisscrossed with acequias, irrigation channels that could trip a horse or break a leg if crossed carelessly. The good knight kept his eyes on the rider in front of him, trusting Tormentor to find the footing. The horse was sure-footed, bred for this kind of work. But the good knight could feel the animal's tension, the way its ears flicked back and forth, listening for danger. They passed through an orchard, orange trees, their branches heavy with fruit that no one had harvested. The scent was overwhelming, sweet and cloying, mixing with the smell of horse sweat and oiled leather. Ahead, the good knight could hear the faint sound of fighting from the west. The bait force had engaged the Almoravid vanguard at Mislata. Shouts, the clash of steel, the distinctive thrum of crossbow bolts. And then, louder, the drums. The Almoravid drums began to beat in earnest, a deep, resonant pounding that seemed to come from the earth itself. It was a call to arms, a signal that the main army was mobilizing. The good knight felt his heart rate spike. This was the critical moment. If the Almoravids sent scouts south, if they realized the true threat was coming from the Batalla gate and not the western walls. But the drums continued to beat from the direction of Mislata. They had taken the bait. El Cid raised his hand again, and the column picked up. Speed! They were no longer trying to stay hidden. They were racing against time. The good knight leaned forward in the saddle, feeling Tormentor's muscles bunch and release beneath him. The horse was eager now, sensing the urgency. Around him, the other knights were doing the same, the formation loosening slightly as they moved from a careful walk to a trot, then to a canter. The village of Cuarte appeared on the horizon, a cluster of low buildings silhouetted against the faint glow of the eastern sky. Behind it, the Almoravid camp sprawled across the plain, a city of tents, banners and fires. The good knight could see movement now, figures running between the tents. The camp was stirring, responding to the sound of battle from the east. but they were looking the wrong way. El Cid drew his sword, Tizona flashing in the growing light, and pointed it toward the camp. The column surged forward. Chapter 4. The Charge. The good knight couched his lance, locking it under his right arm, feeling the weight of the weapon settle into place. The technique was still relatively new. Some of the older knights preferred to hold the lance overhand like a spear, but the good knight had trained for years to perfect the couched position. It allowed him to transfer the full momentum of the horse into the target, turning the lance into a battering ram. The formation was a wedge now, with El Cid at the tip and the rest of the knights fanning out behind him. 3,000 armored men on 3,000 war horses, moving at a full gallop across the plain. The sound was like an avalanche. The good knight could feel the vibration through Tormentor's body, the rhythmic pounding of hooves that seemed to shake the earth. The wind tore at his face, whipping his cloak behind him. His vision narrowed to the space directly ahead, the back of the rider in front of him, the growing mass of the Almoravid camp, the white tents that seemed to rush toward him with terrifying speed. He could see the perimeter now. There were guards, Berber spearmen in light armor, standing in loose clusters, their attention focused toward the east, where the sound of battle was coming from. They didn't see the charge until it was too late. The first line of Almoravid guards turned, their faces registering shock, then terror. A few tried to form up, raising their spears, but there was no time. The wedge of Castilian knights hit them like a tidal wave. The good knight's lance struck a man in the chest, punching through the quilted armor and lifting him off his feet. The impact jolted up the good knight's arm, nearly wrenching the lance from his grip, but he held on, feeling the weapon tear free as Tormentor surged forward. Then they were in the camp. The world became chaos. Tents collapsed under the weight of the horses. Men scrambled out of bedrolls, half-dressed, weaponless, their faces pale with shock. The good knight discarded the lance. It was useless now in close quarters, and drew his sword, a 3-foot blade of Castilian steel. He swung at a figure running past, felt the blade connect, saw the man go down. Around him, the other knights were doing the same. The camp was a maze of canvas and rope, and the horses were trampling everything in their path. Fires were kicked over, spreading flames to the dry tents. Smoke began to rise, thick and black, blotting out the dawn sky. The good knight heard screaming, high-pitched, terrified screaming that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Camp followers, women and children, non-combatants who had thought themselves safe behind the lines of the army. War did not distinguish. He rode deeper into the camp, following the flow of the charge. His sword was slick with blood now, and his arm ached from the repeated impacts. Tormentor was breathing hard, foam flecking the horse's neck, but the animal did not slow. They reached the center of the camp, where the largest tents stood, the command pavilions, marked by tall banners bearing the Almoravid standard. These tents were guarded by the Black Guard, the elite sub-Saharan soldiers who formed the core of the Almoravid army. The Black Guard did not run. They formed a line, shields locked, spears leveled, their faces set in grim determination. They were outnumbered, surrounded, but they held their ground. The good knight saw El Cid ride straight at them, Babieka's hooves churning the earth. The Cid did not slow. He crashed into the line, his sword rising and falling, and the Black Guard line buckled. The good knight followed, driving Tormentor into the gap. His sword struck a shield, glanced off, struck again. A spear thrust toward him, and he twisted in the saddle, feeling the point scrape across his mail. He brought his sword down on the spearman's helmet, felt the metal crumple, saw the man drop. And then the line broke. The Black Guard, the most disciplined soldiers in the Almoravid army, scattered. The good knight reined Tormentor to a halt, breathing hard, his vision swimming. Around him, the camp was burning. Smoke rose in thick columns, and the screams had turned to a dull roar, a background noise that seemed to blend with the crackle of flames. He looked toward the east, toward the main Almoravid army that had been mobilizing to fight the bait force at Mislata. They had stopped. The good knight could see them in the distance, a dark mass of men frozen in place, staring at the smoke rising from their camp. He could imagine what they were seeing, their base of operations in flames, their supplies burning, their retreat cut off. And then, slowly, the mass began to dissolve. It started at the edges, small groups of men breaking away, running toward the camp or away from it, the formation losing cohesion. Then larger groups, then entire units. The Almoravid army was not retreating. It was disintegrating. The good knight heard a horn, El Cid's horn, sounding the rally. The knights began to regroup, forming up in the center of the burning camp. They were battered, bloodied, but intact. El Cid rode to the front, his armor scorched, his sword still in his hand. He looked at the fleeing Almoravid army, and he smiled. "Now we finish it," he said. Chapter 5. The Anvil. The good knight had thought the charge into the camp was the climax of the battle. He was wrong. The pursuit was worse. El Cid did not give the Almoravids time to regroup. He turned the cavalry, now reorganized into a loose formation, and charged toward the disintegrating enemy army. At the same time, the bait force from the western gates, seeing the Almoravid collapse, counterattacked. The Almoravids were caught between two forces, with their camp burning behind them and no clear line of retreat. The good knight rode into the mass of fleeing men, his sword rising and falling mechanically. There was no honor in this, no glory. It was butchery. Men threw down their weapons and ran. Others tried to surrender, raising their hands, shouting in Arabic that the good knight did not understand. He did not stop. This was the logic of medieval warfare. A routed army was a dead army. If you let them escape, they would regroup, resupply, and return. The only way to ensure victory was to break them so completely that they could never threaten you again. The good knight's sword arm was numb. His vision was tunneling, the edges going dark. He could feel Tormenta stumbling beneath him, the horse exhausted, running on instinct alone. And then, suddenly, it was over. The Almoravid army was gone, scattered across the plain, fleeing toward the Jucar River or the hills to the south. The battlefield was littered with bodies, discarded weapons, and the remnants of the once mighty camp. The good knight reined Tormenta to a halt and slid from the saddle, his legs nearly buckling as his feet hit the ground. He leaned against the horse, breathing hard, his entire body shaking with exhaustion. Around him, the other knights were doing the same. Some were wounded, gashes on arms, blood seeping through mail. Others were simply spent, sitting on the ground with their helmets off, staring at nothing. The good knight looked toward the city of Valencia, now visible in the full light of morning. The walls were lined with people, citizens, soldiers, anyone who could climb the ramparts, watching the aftermath of the battle. They were cheering. The sound was faint, carried on the wind, but it was unmistakable. The city had been saved. El Cid rode past, still mounted, his face unreadable. He did not celebrate. He simply surveyed the field, taking stock of the victory, already thinking about the next move. The good knight watched him go, and he thought about the nature of war. They had won. They had defeated an army 5 times their size. They had secured Valencia, at least for now. But the cost? The good knight looked at the bodies scattered across the plain. Almoravid soldiers, yes, but also camp followers, women, children, people who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. He thought about the men he had killed. He could not remember their faces. He could not remember how many there had been. He thought about the charge, the moment when the lance had struck home, the way the man had been lifted off his feet. He thought about the pursuit, the mechanical rise and fall of his sword. He thought about the screaming. And he thought about the fact that he would do it all again if El Cid asked. Because that was what it meant to be a knight. Chapter 6. The spoils, the looting of the Almoravid camp took 3 days. The good knight participated, as did every other man in El Cid's army. It was expected. It was, in many ways, the entire point of the campaign. Medieval soldiers were not paid regular wages. They were paid in plunder. The wealth of the Almoravid camp was the reward for the risk they had taken. And the camp was wealthy beyond imagination. The good knight walked through the remains of the tent city, stepping over collapsed canvas and charred wood. The fires had been put out, but the smell of smoke still hung in the air, mixing with the stench of death. He found a tent that had belonged to one of the Almoravid commanders, a large pavilion with silk hangings and carpets that had somehow survived the flames. Inside, there were chests filled with gold dinars, silver dirhams, and jewelry. There were weapons, curved swords with intricate engravings, daggers with hilts inlaid with precious stones. There were bolts of some, fine cloth, spices, and even books, Arabic manuscripts that the good knight could not read but knew were valuable. He took what he could carry, a small chest of coins, a sword that was lighter and better balanced than his own, a cloak of fine wool that would keep him warm through the winter. It felt strange, this methodical collection of wealth in the aftermath of slaughter. But it was the way of things. Around him, other knights were doing the same. Some were laughing, joking about their finds. Others were silent, their faces drawn. The good knight saw Alvar Fanez overseeing the collection of horses. Thousands of Arab and Berber mounts had been captured, along with their tack and saddles. These would be distributed among the army, replacing the horses that had been lost or injured in the charge. Tormenta had survived, though the horse was limping slightly. The good knight had already checked the leg, a minor strain, nothing that wouldn't heal with rest. He was grateful. A knight without a horse was not a knight. He saw El Cid standing near the center of the camp, surrounded by his captains. They were discussing the next steps: how to secure the city, how to distribute the plunder, how to prepare for the inevitable Almoravid counterattack, because there would be a counterattack. The good knight knew this. Everyone knew this. The Battle of Cuarte had been a stunning victory, but it had not destroyed the Almoravid Empire. It had merely delayed them. Yusuf ibn Tashfin, the emperor himself, would not tolerate this humiliation. He would send another army, larger and better prepared, and El Cid would have to face them again. But for now, there was a moment of respite, a moment to breathe, to rest, to count the cost. The good knight walked to the edge of the camp, where the plain stretched out toward the horizon. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the battlefield. In the distance, he could see the walls of Valencia, the city that had been saved. He thought about the men who had died to save it. The Almoravid soldiers, yes, but also the Christian knights who had fallen in the charge. He had seen Pedro Bermudez take a spear to the throat. He had seen Martin Antolinez's horse go down, the rider crushed beneath the weight. War did not distinguish between the brave and the cowardly, the skilled and the lucky. It simply consumed. The good knight stood there for a long time, watching the sun sink below the horizon, feeling the weight of his armor, the weight of his sword, the weight of everything he had done. And then he turned and walked back toward the city. Chapter 7. The Reckoning. The weeks following the Battle of Cuarte were a strange mixture of celebration and tension. Valencia erupted in festivities. The citizens, who had endured 19 months of siege followed by 2 months of Almoravid encirclement, poured into the streets. There were feasts, processions, and public prayers of thanksgiving. El Cid was hailed as a savior, a hero, a legend. The good knight attended some of these celebrations, but he found them hollow. He could not shake the images from the battlefield, the burning tents, the screaming, the bodies. He spent most of his time in the barracks, maintaining his equipment. The hauberk needed repairs. Several rings had been broken during the charge. The sword needed sharpening. The shield needed a new leather cover. These were the mundane tasks of a knight, the unglamorous work that kept a man alive. One evening, as he sat in the courtyard of the Alcazar, working oil into the leather straps of his saddle, Alvar, Fanez, approached. The older knight sat down beside him, groaning slightly as his joints protested. "You fought well," Alvar said. The good knight did not look up. "I survived. That's the same thing in this business." They sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the rasp of the good knight's cloth against the leather. "Do you ever wonder," the good knight said quietly, "if it's worth it?" Alvar raised an eyebrow. "The fighting?" "All of it. The killing, the looting, the everything." Alvar was quiet for a long moment. Then he sighed. "Every day," he said. "But then I think about the alternative. If we hadn't fought at Cuarte, the Almoravids would have taken the city. They would have executed El Cid, probably tortured him first to make an example. They would have slaughtered or enslaved everyone who had supported him. And then they would have moved on to the next city and the next, until there was nothing left of Christian Spain but memories." He looked at the good knight. "We didn't fight for glory. We fought because the alternative was worse." The good knight considered this. It was a pragmatic answer, a soldier's answer. It did not make the weight any lighter, but it made it bearable. "Do you think we can hold the city?" he asked. Alvar shrugged. "For a while. El Cid is already planning the defenses. He's using the gold from the Almoravid camp to hire more soldiers, to repair the walls, to stockpile supplies. He's turning Valencia into a fortress. And when the Almoravids come back, we'll fight them again and again, until one side or the other runs out of men." It was a bleak assessment, but the good knight knew it was accurate. This was the reality of the Reconquista. It was not a single war with a clear beginning and end. It was a grinding, generational struggle that would outlive everyone currently fighting it. The good knight would fight in more battles. He would see more cities fall and rise. He would kill more men, loot more camps, and carry more weight. But he would survive. Because that was what he did. In the years that followed the Battle of Cuarte, the story of the engagement grew in the telling. Bards sang of El Cid's genius, of the daring flanking maneuver, of the charge into the heart of the enemy camp. They sang of the 3,000 knights who rode like thunder, of the Almoravid army that dissolved like mist, of the wealth that was captured. They did not sing about the screaming. The good knight heard these songs in taverns and great halls, and he said nothing. Let them have their legends. Let them believe that war was glorious and heroic. He knew the truth, but he also knew that the legend served a purpose. It inspired men to fight, to believe that victory was possible even against impossible odds. It gave hope to the people of Valencia, who lived under the constant threat of another siege. And it terrified the Almoravids. The Battle of Cuarte had shattered the myth of Berber invincibility. For the first time since Agrayas, a Christian army had defeated the Almoravids in open battle. The psychological impact was immense. Other Christian kingdoms took note. If El Cid could hold Valencia, perhaps they could hold their own territories. Perhaps the tide was turning. The good knight did not know if the tide was turning. He only knew that he was still standing, still fighting, still carrying the weight of his armor and his sword. In 1097, the Almoravids returned, just as everyone had known they would. They brought an even larger army, determined to erase the humiliation of Quart. El Cid met them at Byron, another village near Valencia, and defeated them again using similar tactics: deception, maneuver, and the devastating charge of heavy cavalry. The good knight was there for that battle too, and he survived. He always survived. Rodrigo Díaz de Vivar died in 1099, not in battle, but in his bed, of natural causes. The good knight was not present when it happened. He was on patrol, riding the borders of the Valencian territory, watching for Almoravid scouts. When he returned and heard the news, he felt a strange emptiness. El Cid had been the center of everything, the reason they fought, the reason they stayed, the reason they believed they could hold this impossible city against an empire. Without him, what were they? Jimena, El Cid's widow, took control of the city. She was a formidable woman, and she held Valencia for 3 more years. But everyone knew it was only a matter of time. The Almoravids came again in 1102, and this time there was no genius to outmaneuver them, no daring plan to turn the tide. Jimena negotiated a withdrawal. The Christian population of Valencia was allowed to leave, taking their possessions and their dignity. The good knight was part of the exodus. He rode out of the city gates, one last time, looking back at the walls that he had defended for nearly a decade. The Almoravids entered the city and tore down the churches, reconsecrating the mosques. Valencia returned to Muslim rule, and it would remain so for more than a century. But the legend of El Cid endured, and the good knight, riding north toward Castile, carried that legend with him. He had stood at Cuarte. He had charged into the heart of the enemy camp. He had seen the Almoravid army break and flee. He had survived, and he would continue to survive, riding through history, witnessing the rise and fall of kingdoms, the clash of empires, the endless cycle of war, because that was what he did. That was what he would always do. Years later, in a tavern somewhere in Castile, the good knight sat alone, nursing a cup of wine. A young knight approached him, eager and bright-eyed, the kind of man who had never seen real battle. "Is it true?" the young knight asked. "Were you really at Cuarte?" The good knight looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," he said quietly. "What was it like?" The good knight thought about the charge, the burning tents, the screaming. He thought about the weight of the armor, the weight of the sword, the weight of everything he had done. "It was necessary," he said finally. The young knight looked disappointed, as if he had expected a more heroic answer. But the good knight had no heroic answers. He had only the truth. And the truth was that war was not glorious. It was not heroic. It was brutal and ugly and necessary, and it left scars that never fully healed. But it was also the crucible in which history was forged. The Battle of Cuarte had saved Valencia, at least for a time. It had proven that the Almoravids could be beaten. It had inspired a generation of Christian knights to believe that the Reconquista was possible. And the good knight had been there. He had stood in the silver armor, had couched the lance, had charged into the heart of the enemy. He had survived, and he would carry that weight for the rest of his days. The young knight eventually left, seeking more exciting stories elsewhere. The good knight finished his wine and stood, feeling the familiar ache in his joints, the weight of years and battles. He walked out into the night, into the world that was always changing, always fighting, always moving forward. And he walked alone, as he always had, as he always would, because he was the good knight. And his story was not over, not yet.